Hello, and welcome to Rock, Paper, Swords, the historical action and adventure podcast. My name is Matthew Harffy,
And my name is Justin Hill.
and if you'd like to help us with our running costs and get exclusive bonus episodes every month, along with other great perks, you could do worse than check out our Patreon page, and you could sign up there for as little as £1 per month and get all sorts of wonderful things.
And if you enjoy this episode, please leave us a 5-star review and share our posts on Facebook, X, Blue Sky, and wherever you find us, and help us get the word out.
I was just thinking that I missed out about the Patreon things, that we've got new tiers now, of course, which have been out for a few weeks. But of those new tiers, or as part of those new tiers, one of the rewards is a Q&A with us every few months, every quarter, I think it is. So for the executive producer level VIPs and legends, they get this mini Q&A session with us where they can ask us anything. So we've got one of those coming up, actually, which we need to record and put out there for our patrons of those
Yeah.
tiers. So we'll be doing that after this episode, perhaps. But until then, let's get on with this episode. So how are things going with you, Justin?
Yeah, very good. Quite busy. What am I doing? I wrote the last scene of my contemporary thriller novel last week, and I was reworking it today. Um, it did, you kind of an ending is kind of a stab in the dark, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
I had an idea of what happened, and I wrote it, and it didn't quite feel right when I wrote it. So I left it over. I had a friend visiting from Canada on Thursday and Friday, so I've given it kind of 4 days over the weekend and came back to it, and I've been reworking it. And I think I've got a better idea of now where it is going to go.
I feel like most of my writing feels like it doesn't feel quite right when I'm doing it, but it's often I find increasingly my writing process is, if it was like the analogy of like creating a statue or something, is like chiseling
Mm.
off huge chunks of rock to get some sort of shape, and then you look at it and think, well, that doesn't look anything like a David or whatever, and then you have to go back in and start sort of
Maybe
honing
it's a
away. And it's
squirrel.
the but the editing is much more. It's that sort of fine, the polishing and sort of getting it much more attuned to what you want it to look like. But that initial draft for me, perhaps where your initial ending that you wrote is much more sort of, well, it's something like that, but I'm not really sure, or maybe bits are missing. And
Yeah, it's kind of it's a crude effort, and
yeah,
it didn't kind of resolve the story well enough. Because obviously, you set up a lot of things in the novel, and I wanted it to kind of to try and answer those. I've got the last line, I think, which is brilliant.
nice.
Yeah, the last kind of moment. So that's very good. I just need to, get the bit in between.
I
Um,
need to come up with the last line. I'm very close to the ending as well of this first draft of the novel that I'm writing, and I've written like a big sort of clash, and then I'm now doing the sort of the epilogue aftermath kind of couple of chapters of sort of wind down and trying to tie up all the loose ends. But there's still going to be a few little revelations, I guess, at the
mm,
end, maybe little twists and things. And I need to. I'm sort of finding my way almost in the dark through it, because I have very sort of nebulous idea of what this ending is going to be. And so as I'm writing it, as I keep writing, I keep thinking, oh, and I've got to mention so and so, and oh, what about this guy? Oh, what? Oh, yes, and then I sort of have to rewrite the whole thing and start again. And just today, this is interesting for me when we talk about these things. It's so interesting to think about, how everyone's process is very, very different, but also how incredibly fluid the process of creativity is.
mm.
And today, suddenly I started reading a book called Red Rising, which is a fantasy, well, sci-fi novel, written about 10 years ago, I think. Now it's
Mhm.
first of a series. My daughter bought it for me for my birthday. And I started reading it, and as I was reading it, I was thinking, oh, it does a really good job of setting the scene, because it's a sci-fi novel, so it has to sort of you has to drop you into something interesting, but also set the scene of where you are, what's happening, what the people, how do they live. And I suddenly thought today, oh, maybe I need to add a prologue,
Mm.
or a chapter that sets the scene more than dropping us straight into the action, which is kind of what I've done at the moment. I think maybe I need a sort of scene setter of 6 months before the events of the story unfold, because otherwise it's going to be difficult to root for a guy whose whole motivation is trying to find what's happened to his loved ones if you don't ever see the loved ones or see any of his life before the loved ones have gone, and so it's, yeah. Anyway,
Yeah, because
so
sometimes it's not until you finish the novel that you can kind of see the thing in its whole. For example, there's something that happens to one of my main characters, which was kind of incidental when I wrote the first draft, which now I've realized is actually fundamental to the whole story. Um, so I know I'm going to go back and change that scene and make it much bigger. So I'm writing the ending thinking, okay, I've already changed that. But of course, once I get the ending right, I have to go back and change all kinds of things through the novel to make sure
yeah,
it fits the ending.
yeah, I haven't gone back and read, what I wrote before Christmas and everything. So there's stuff there that I can really vaguely remember, the details of the scenes of the chapters. And certain themes have definitely come out as the stories progressed of my book. And even in that sort of final confrontation between the villain or the antagonist and the main character, there was sort of dialogue there, and some of it's kind of exposition-y sort of stuff, trying to explain what's happened so that you can sort of fill in what's happened behind the scenes, and giving away the revelations of like this is how we got to this point. But other things are sort of themes that I think, oh, maybe these need to be brought out. Well, actually, I'm sure they need to be brought out more
Mm.
in the whole story, and reflections from the antagonist that he says to the typical thing that the antagonist says to the protagonist of like, we're not so different, that sort of thing. But I think actually there's seeds of themes there that could be brought out in the rest of the story and sort of show different sides to the main character. It's a really interesting process, and it's quite daunting sometimes
Yeah.
when you're going through it, because you think, oh my god, I've got to go back and seed all this extra bits and pieces. But
So last time we spoke, I think it was the London Book Fair, and my agent and your editor were going around, selling us off, or flogging us to various people in the book trade. Have you heard anything from that? Anything come through?
I've heard nothing. I don't know how much of that flogging was going on, but I know they were not in the office for a while. But things have started to get noisy again, because they've started to ask me again for feedback on
Mm.
maps. And I got the proofread. Oh, this is another thing I did last week. I was busy. I got the proofreader comment, so we could talk. We'll do an episode at some point about the whole life cycle of a novel. I think that would be really interesting. But the proofreader sort of moment is when the book really has gone through multiple editing phases, very sort of clean. It's been read lots of times by different people, and really they're just going through sort of finding comma here or a semicolon, or they're missing a letter in a word or something.
Yeah.
Those sort of things, are a spelling mistake. It's all very sort of minor stuff, until I got this comment from the chapter 27 of the book that's coming out in June. And they said, they highlighted a couple of paragraphs of dialogue. I said, I'm not really sure when this is taking place, this conversation here. Is this taking place before the next thing that happens? Because when you read the chapter, it kind of doesn't make sense. And I thought, well, what are you talking about? This, of course, it makes perfect sense.
Foolish
I'm,
person.
I'm not an idiot. That's my
I'm the
initial,
author.
my initial sort of response. To think, how dare you question me? And so I went back and I read it all, and I thought, I think maybe they're right. This is very strange. It doesn't quite make sense. And I thought, how this has been through, like, copy edit, my edits. It's been
Yeah.
read by beta readers. It's been read by loads of people. And it sort of did make sense, because by the time you get to the end of the chapter, you've kind of forgotten what sets up the beginning of the chapter. So it's just like a timeline kind of slip thing. But anyway, I then realized, I thought, oh my goodness, I'm going to have to rewrite sections of this to make it work. But I don't want to change it too much, because the chapter ended on a cliffhanger
Mm.
to leads you into the next chapter. So the next chapter starts, following on from the cliffhanger. So I can't really change the very last two lines of the chapter, and I don't have to change the next chapter. So I have to not only rework the timing and sort of rejig things in this one chapter, it has to be isolated within that chapter without any ramifications that are going to alter other bits. And I want to do a minimal amount of work, but it needs to make sense as well. And it took me a good 2 or 3 hours of work just to
Yeah.
rework this one chapter. It probably only added 10 lines or something, but I had to sort of tweak bits and add a line here and a couple of words there. But
Yeah, it's amazing what can get through. I mean, I've a couple of times I've had. I mean, I hate to reinforce national stereotypes, but the German translator of a novel will come and say, something odd here. And of course, this is a book that's been published already, and it's got to the stage where it's being translated. And you think,
Yeah,
"Oops, yep,
that's no
I
good.
made a boo boo."
Yeah, you don't like that. That's worse. When it's been published, that's even worse. Yeah,
Yeah.
but things just slip through, and it's incredible because
Mm.
the number of times that as the author, we read our own stuff, and then of course all these other layers of readers, and it's just incredible that nobody
Well,
picks up on
I think
certain
it's
things.
partly because there's some, you know, there's so many kind of little changes like that that happen really at the kind of the last minute of a book,
Yeah.
as you're responding to feedback.
I did wonder actually with this now that I had to basically take out a new Word document and create a chapter, paste it in, rework it, in there and this because it was all in PDF at this point. This was like the proofs and send it through. And I did think this is the point where the editor screws up and doesn't paste in what I've sent properly back in. It
Yeah.
misses out on a proofread somewhere along the line. This chapter, and I could quite envisage a situation where the book gets printed and I get a copy of it and look at it and turn to chapter 27 and see, this is the
Yeah.
original one that's wrong, or they've done something else, messed it up somehow. Because
And in a sense, you are making those changes right at the last minute, or
mm,
cuts as well, just to make the book really kind of lean and and kind of tight. Whereas there's the baggier version has lived in your head for maybe years beforehand. So I often don't quite remember which version of the book gets published. I have a version in my head that I spend years with maybe, and then bits get cut or
that's
changed right at the last minute,
that's
and I
really
don't remember
interesting.
them.
I got the a fifth year anniversary release of Wolf of Wessex. They're going to reissue it basically, and they
Yeah,
asked me to write a foreword or a preface, whatever it's called,
fantastic.
introduction. I don't know for it, and that was great. To go back, go and look at it again. And I wrote it sort of from memory, and they asked me to write some questions for like uh, book clubs or whatever, sort
Mm.
of put at the end of the book. And so I sort of wrote these questions from memory, and then I thought I better go and check, the answers and check and look at the books, because I've asked certain things like, "What did you think about this scene?" or whatever. And I went
How
back,
great is
and
Matthew Harffy?
the ending was different than what I remembered, and it's
Wow.
exactly what you're saying. And I think the
Yeah,
ending that I remembered was the first ending I wrote. But
yeah.
then when it went through all the reviewing process, the editor at some point said, "I don't think that's right. You should change this." And in the end, the same, the baddie's the same, and he gets killed, whatever. The sort of things happen, but the order of events was different, and the person that does the killing was different. So it's very, very different. So I thought there was an arc. I was sort of saying, what did you think of this character's arc? And when they ended like that, they don't actually do that. So those things are
Yeah,
really interesting.
it is interesting.
But moving on from our writing, which
Mm.
sounds like it's going pretty well, I saw some news you posted. I don't know if it's today or yesterday about you being a tutor or mentor in
I'm actually
something.
writer in, I was being modest. I'm actually the writer in residence. So,
Writer in residence. Oh, give it. Come on,
yeah, so
plug
it's
it.
an
Although
MFA
I
in
did notice
creative
that you haven't
writing.
mentioned the podcast in your bio on the.
Have I not?
No, no, very bad. You have to
Shame on
update
me.
that. You need to
Yeah.
cross pollinate wherever you can. Anyway, come on,
Yes.
tell
So
us about it.
it's a student of mine. So I used to teach on an MFA, to Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing at City University of Hong Kong. And it's a student of mine who has set one up in Sardinia. He's Sardinian and very passionate about his country or home island. And they have a Nobel Prize winning author called Grazia Deledda from the 1930s. And it's named in honor of her. It's the Grazia Deledda MFA in Creative Writing. It's a low residency course, so we kind of 2 weeks where we get together in the autumn, early autumn in Sardinia, in Oristano, which is a lovely kind of
That sounds amazing.
yeah,
If you need a someone to carry your bags or like
visiting writer.
a visiting writer of the writer in residence, I can rock up just for like a couple of days. I won't take up much space. It'll be fine.
Yeah, I can't believe how good it is. I get to go to Sardinia every year. So yeah, so there'll be kind of low residencies. We'll be working online with our students, and then we'll get together, once a year and kind of have workshops and things. And yeah, it's the first year. I should find the website and
So Yeah,
post it.
we can, so we can put the website into the show notes
Show
of this,
notes.
and I suppose it's open for students to apply
Applications, yeah.
applications. Yeah, so yeah, anyone who's feeling like they want to take that step, have a look at it.
And I I did a master's, but very similar process. And certainly we've been modeling the MFA on what I think is really good creative writing practice, which is not about teaching. People often ask, can you teach creative writing? And I don't think you can, but you can put people in an environment where they kind of learn more quickly.
Yeah,
And I did an MA in creative writing at Lancaster, and I'd already published a novel and written a second one. And I learned more in the first 2 weeks of that MA than at any other point in kind of my writing career. I realized how intelligent the reader is, in the same way someone walks into a room and you immediately make decisions about them. You see Matthew, and you think, my, what a talented young man this is.
what an amazing guy! You think, yeah, instantly.
Yeah, and so the same thing as when a character walks into a novel, you bring that same level of intelligence. So I realized just how much you can kind of cut things back. Anyway, so it's a really fun. I mean, I love doing it in Hong Kong because invariably with an MFA, you've got kind of a lot of mature students
Yeah,
at various points in their career. We had people in their kind of from their mid-20s up to their 70s, and so you have a really kind of diverse bunch of people telling all kinds of different stories, and it's so much fun. So I'm really looking forward to it.
oh, it sounds brilliant. And
Yeah.
it's interesting you say about you can't really teach creative writing, but you could sort of talk around the process and sort of put people in a really good mental place where they've got tools that they can use and give them
Yeah,
the
and I
right
guess
environment to discuss things and to grow as
yeah,
writers, I guess.
yeah, I'm a huge fan of workshops, so where you read each other's material and kind of give feedback. And so for most of us learning to write, we sit alone in a room and we spend most of our time alone without much kind of external input. So workshops are great because as a kind of writer, when you're workshopping other people's work, then you're learning so much about writing and how stories work and all that. You can do anything with a story or tell it any way you like.
Yeah.
Um, and when you're being workshopped, then you get to hear how the readers are interpreting what you've written and whether that's what you want or not. And I often think we don't appreciate what's good about our writing. Because often we think we live in our own heads and the things we think of are kind of mundane and normal. But actually, to other people, they could be, pearls of wisdom. Um,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
so you suddenly, there's bits I would have cut from, all my writing that other people say, oh, this is brilliant. And I think, oh, is it really? Okay.
Yeah. It's this
So
thing of knowing what's good and what's not good, and it's it's really interesting. I mean, I'm gonna have to we're gonna have to move on in a minute because I can see our guest has arrived in the
yeah,
waiting room. But yeah, I was working on some slides for this masterclass that I've got to do in a couple of weeks with the history quill. I'm doing a
mm,
masterclass with them, and I was thinking it's very difficult to know what level to pitch things at. And so these slides, I mean, one of the things I'm going to say is like, I've put together basically everything I can think of. And some of these things are things that, come naturally to me. And some things might come naturally to them that don't come naturally to me. But, it's all just stuff to hopefully help people to go away from the course thinking that they've learned something that's useful, or at least feel that there's something
yeah.
useful. But it's very difficult to know what you can actually give to people that will serve them in that sort of learning environment, as
Well, I
well as, like
guess
you say, in a creative writing. When you're
yeah,
actually
for
reading
most
book.
people, they'll have never spent an hour in a room with another author, especially,
Yeah.
a published author like you. And so they're gonna, there's stuff will keep dripping off you that people will be like lapping up. Um,
Wow, what an image! That's
yeah.
an image. Luckily it's over Zoom, or else I would be getting. Yeah, that sounds a bit strange. But moving on swiftly from the attendees of this masterclass, licking off the
Pills of,
oozing
yeah.
ichor of my wisdom. Um, let's get our guest in.
Peter Jones is a historian and writer whose work explores the intersection of medieval thought and modern life. His latest book, Self-Help from the Middle Ages, was inspired by a bleak winter teaching alone in Siberia, where he was struck by the idea that the medieval concept of the seven deadly sins might actually teach us how to live better. Blending history, psychology, and personal reflection, Peter uncovers a world where monks, mystics, and theologians grappled with many of the same struggles we face today: anxiety, desire, burnout, and meaning. His work challenges our assumptions about the so-called Dark Ages and suggests that, in some ways, the past may have understood us better than we understand ourselves. Peter, welcome.
Oh, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, welcome to Rock Paper Swords. And you mentioned, Justin mentioned there in the introduction that your inspiration for the book came when you were in Siberia. You were teaching at university there. So what took you to Siberia in the first place?
Oh, I ask myself that question all the time. My wife is also an academic, and at that time we were expecting our first child. She was pregnant, and we were both in Providence, actually, in the United States, and we were desperate for a job. We needed a job, two of us in the same city, and my wife was looking, and she found a job in Tumen, and she thought that was in Germany. So she applied, and it was only when she got the email back, Skype interview, it was actually Tumen. We Googled it. Okay, it's all in Cyrillic. Okay, it must be near Moscow. Oh, maybe that's fun. We didn't realize it was Siberia really until the kind of booking flights to go for the full interview kind of stage. Do you know what? I mean, it was such an amazing place to teach, and it was such an amazing idea. It was, all in the English language. It was kind of like building a bridge to the West for the next generation of Russians, students who'd grown up exclusively under Vladimir Putin. We had the first students who had that, that life cycle. And it was really fun. We were teaching feminism. We were teaching all kinds of things. The Stonewall riots. Teaching history to Russians felt really exciting, and a totally different set of assumptions about the past too. It got a bit bleak for me. My wife then got a job at Trinity College Dublin, and out of idiocy, I didn't want to quit. I didn't want to stop being a historian. I didn't want to stop writing articles and teaching. So I was like, I'll just stay here for a little while longer, and I'll join you later. She went back with our daughter, to Dublin. Like a fool, I stayed on in Siberia, and the book is written from that place. The loneliness which crept up on me pretty quickly. And something which I describe in the book as Arcadia, which is the fourth deadly sin of sloth, which I experienced there. So, and I should say before we speak more, I loved Tumen. I loved Siberia. It was a wonderful place. The Siberia that I wanted to escape in the end was not the actual Siberia. That's beautiful. It was actually the Siberia I made for myself, really, by I guess spending too much time on my own.
Oh, very interesting. And I haven't finished it, but I've got a copy here of the book Self-Help from the Middle Ages, and it's incredibly interesting. It's the way you describe your own personal journey and link it in with all of the journey of the mind, through the Middle Ages as well. And you suggest in the book, of course, that medieval people had a really sophisticated understanding of the mind. So what first led you to that idea?
Well, I think for years, so I've been studying the Middle Ages since university, right? And I just caught the bug. And there's so many texts I would read, and I loved like the monastic theology of Bernard of Clairvaux. Actually, he was my number one. And I don't know why, I can't explain it to you, but those texts just so excited me. And I would read these texts, preparing for seminars and stuff, and I just found them so kind of insightful about the mind and about thought. And there's something about Bernard in particular, actually. He seems to understand the way our minds work in a really nuanced, forgiving way. I felt this was someone who saw more deeply into any soul than I ever will. You know what I mean? And I think I just took that for granted for years. And I was just, oh yeah, I like these texts. And, it never occurred to me that these texts, A, weren't very well known, and B, other people might love them too. It's just that maybe they're kind of in the wrong box in the library, medieval theology. People don't necessarily open it. So for years, I've been reading these texts and thinking, wow, this is really, I'd got a lot of kind of, insights myself about how the mind works, and, about temptation, desire, anxiety, disillusionment, all the fun things. I'd kind of been, a good monastic theologian will tease those out, in a good sermon, which will talk about, those moments where you're drifting off and you feel like life is pointless. Here's where you can help yourself get out of those. Bernard will write about something like that. So it was when I was in Chimin teaching in Siberia. Our director he never let me teach the Middle Ages, unfortunately, the director of our institute. He wanted me to teach the 1960s or I don't know, any other topic you can imagine. But he always thought the Middle Ages was a bit irrelevant. And so one day I said, well, what about the 7 deadly sins? Could I teach that? And he liked that. So he let me teach it to us. Finally, let me teach my subject to the students. And as we were doing that class, I realized, these things are really, really relevant. I mean, we talk about envy or something like that. And it's just, you can't talk about envy without reflecting on how you've seen that happen today in your own life or on social media, and the same with anger, the same with pride. So it's kind of, I get more and more convinced that these things are relevant the more I kind of poked around in them, really.
And when was Bernard of Clairvaux, you were saying?
Yeah.
When was he alive? Yes. And what exactly was he saying that chimed with you so much?
Okay, he's alive from 1090 to 1153. So okay. What is it? Okay, Bernard is like the most eloquent writer. He's someone who's written so beautifully about love, right? He's got a treatise called On Loving God, where he writes about falling in love with someone else as like you are a drop of water and you're dripping, you're falling into this other person like their wine, right? You dissolve. In the same way that a drop of water would dissolve when dropped in wine, that's what falling in love is like. You annihilate yourself and you become something stronger and richer in the process. So he's a master of metaphor, right? And what makes him, I suppose, what attracted me to that kind of writing? I don't know. I think so. He's quite a special personality because you can watch him kind of, you can map out his intellectual journey. He's the kind of person who people were writing biographies about him before he died, which is, unheard of, especially in the Middle Ages. That stuff, celebrity culture like that just didn't happen. But Bernard had it while he was alive. William of Saint-Chery, his protege, wrote this life of him. So, and through texts like that, we can see his journey. We can see the young man who loved writing romance poetry. He used to write kind of slightly dirty songs. He had an enormous capacity for desire and love himself. And he writes about, or William writes how one day Bernard's at a picnic. He's a little bit bored, a little bit outside of the conversation. So he sees this girl across the lake and she seems lonely, isolated, just like him. And he feels something. What is that thing? Well, he recognizes it immediately as lust and throws himself in the freezing lake because he can't bear this feeling of desire. What I love about a story like that, it tells us a couple of things. It tells us, number one, that this is somebody who had a kind of innovative approach to dealing with temptation. But number two, he felt those things really strongly. You don't throw yourself in a lake because, you have a mild flickering of temptation. This is obviously someone who felt the raw power of lust. And the great thing about Bernard is we watch his life unfold. This is someone who converted his 7 brothers, it might be 6, all to the monastery. He joined a monastery when he was a young man and he wanted all of his brothers to join as well. And so they all did. That's how strong he was as a personality. I think I say in the book, he's a kind of square peg in a round hole, but he's the kind of square peg that makes everyone else want to be square as well. And we can watch his kind of journey. And, by the time he's writing that treatise about falling in love with God, you can see that same raw power that he felt when he was writing dirty poetry or when he was throwing himself in the lake because he was scared by his own lust. He managed to convert that into something kind of meaningful and philosophical. Like On Loving God is really a treatise about how we take that power that you feel when you fall in love with someone and turn that towards something bigger, like falling in love with the universe, falling in love with life itself. So, electrifying writer.
It reminds me a little bit about like John Donne and the sort of transition from bawdy poems to then very religious, and that sort of, I suppose, if you've got passion and you're very creative and artistic, that's going to carry through, and you'll be very passionate in whatever field you're in. But it makes me think, I mean, one thing that I think is interesting, talking about looking at the 7 deadly sins and the learning of all these different medieval theologians and monastic priests and everyone around, that it's all very obvious. By definition, it's very, very linked into religion and Christianity. Obviously, we're in a very secular society now in the West, Um, how much is religion important, do you think, for mental health? And how much does that sort of touch? Do you touch on that in this the self help for the modern reader?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm very conscious. I was very conscious writing the book that a lot of the self-help advice of the Middle Ages includes the word God, and includes words like, belief, faith, and so on. But I'm convinced, and I can't be unconvinced, that this advice works regardless of whether you believe in God or not, and that you can take God out of the equation, and it's still a great insight, and it's still a mechanism that works. I think. Okay, look, I think for the modern secular age, how important is religion? It's a great question, but I think, what is the mechanism of religion? I believe there's something out there that I don't understand, that I cannot understand. Often religion is a way to do that, to let that into your life, let that sense of there's something bigger than me that I can't grasp. And there's something humbling and empowering as well about that. And so you don't have to believe in God or be religious to do that. My brother's a big believer. My brother loves aliens, but and he's always talking about the stars. He shows me maps and constellations. For him, I think in many ways that has the same function for him. It's studying the stars and thinking about alien life is a way for him to recognize that there's more out there than we can ever comprehend, and that it doesn't make you feel small so much as recognize that we're always situated, that we can never fully understand everything, and that in many ways there's a freedom to that can help. We're talking about self-help from the Middle Ages as a strategy. Dealing with the 7 deadly sins is a process of learning to recognize a situation, learn to recognize yourself for what you are and your limitations. And that sounds quite religious when I say it like that, but that can be done totally in a secular way. Like, I recognize I'm not a fantastic electric guitarist. I'm still learning. I can't, I'm pretty disorganized. I'm a little bit of a control freak as well. So recognizing yourself and your limitations as a way to kind of liberate yourself from having to try to be perfect.
And when did the 7 deadly sins kind of come into being? I mean, I think of it as being something more of the late Middle Ages. Was there a list? Were there 8 deadly sins at one point, and they got kind of whittled down? Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's around about the year 400, a little bit before CE. They begin in the Egyptian desert. A guy called Evagrius Ponticus. So this is just over 1600 years ago. He's a Turkish, what is today Turkey? He's a politician. He has a bit of a career scandal. It's a sex scandal, and he walks away from his political career. And he drifts down to the desert just outside Alexandria, where a lot of people were going who felt disillusioned, to live in cells and kind of meditate, really, weave baskets, find themselves. We could call them monks, but I think it's kind of important that we see that there wasn't really an idea of monk yet. It was more, these are sort of radicals who want to do something different. They're dropouts, alternative life. Evagrius becomes one of them. And he tests himself. He decides that he wants to be the best, I think, of this. He was an ambitious politician. Now he's an ambitious monk. So he decides to put himself through all these physical challenges. He stands in freezing cold water. He lets himself get bitten by all the lice and mosquitoes in the desert. He only eats one little slice of bread with a teaspoon of olive oil a day and things like this. But he also makes a record of all his negative and tempting thoughts. And he writes them all down. And they're really small things sometimes, like, I miss the cup I used to hold in my hands. And the big things sometimes, like, I miss my lover, I wish I could be back on my olive grove on the Black Sea. And in the end, he decides that all of his tempting thoughts belong in 8 buckets. And he calls these the 8 generic thoughts. And they are familiar sounding: vainglory, pride, gluttony, lust, and so on. They're not deadly sins yet. They're generic thoughts. And this is really important for Evagrius. And it's really lovely. And this is why I would say that it's a forgiving system that the Middle Ages inherits. They're not deadly sins. You don't have to be a terrible person to be tempted by any of these things. In fact, you can be the best person out there morally, and you'll still have them. It's only the angels who don't have the generic thoughts, and the saints, perhaps. For the rest of us, we're stuck with these, like a cold, like the cold virus. There's nothing we can do to avoid it. They get whittled down. There's a guy called John Cassian who comes to the desert where Evagrius was, hears about the idea, and decides to repackage them as deadly sins. And then eventually Pope Gregory the Great, around about the year 600, he trims them again. He makes them 7, and he 7 deadly sins, and he gives them a ranking. And this is the final order and ranking that we get. So it's pride, then envy, then anger, then sloth, which Gregory called sadness. We'll come to that maybe a bit later because it's the most enigmatic one. And then avarice, which is greed, gluttony, and then lust. And that's really the system. And they're kind of an academic topic for the early Middle Ages, more or less. They really explode into pop culture, medieval pop culture, in the 1200s onwards, really. And then literature, Chaucer, Dante, John Gower. By the 1300s, they're really everywhere.
To me, when you're saying, I'm thinking about the word sin. It's such a negative connotation, isn't it? I mean, it sounds so sort of moralistic and obviously linked in with religion as well. And it just sounds so archaic and out of place for our modern day living. So when did you sort of said it really? So they lost they lost their original psychological meaning at some point and transitioned into this. Where did the idea of them being sins come from? I guess that's my question, really. Because
I mean, that's right at the beginning. I mean, Cassian already relabels them, and that's the 400s. But I think we should think about what sin means, right? Because I think Rowan Williams, the theologian, former Archbishop of Canterbury, had a great definition. I'm not sure if it's his definition or if it's one that he's repeating, but that a sin is something that you do which is against your better interests. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century described sin as just something which is, an offense to reason. It's something unreasonable. So I don't think sin is necessarily like this act that you do that is kind of arbitrary, like the 10 Commandments. Here are the 10 things you shouldn't do. Like, there's not a list of sins like that. It's not necessarily an act, or it's not necessarily a right thing, wrong thing. It's more, is what you're doing against your better interests.
But being called deadly sins. I mean, that sounds pretty bad, right? I mean,
that's true. That's true. I mean, the thing is, John Cassian, he had a commission. He'd been charged to write this popular preaching book to preach to people, peasants in the countryside in France, and so he needed a hook. Deadly is pretty good. So I think they've always had that accessible dimension. Let's call them the deadly sins. That gets people interested. And then when you dig into it, you realize, actually they're generic thoughts. Generic thoughts just isn't a good label, is it? I mean, I wanted to call the book 7 Generic Thoughts, but it just wasn't flying.
Yeah. I mean, no, it's definitely the 7 deadly sins definitely has a stronger hook. That's true. So you talk in the book about confession and being almost as a form of therapy. When its original structure. I mean, I did a little bit of research into confession and the act of confession within the Catholic Church for some of my novels, and found out that it didn't take place until after a few hundred years. I'm trying to remember when you maybe know. You can maybe tell us when the first confessions were being taken. How systematic or structured was the sort of the whole thing of confession and the use of the 7 deadly sins within that as a framework?
Yeah, I mean, so confession could be lots of different things depending on how good your priest was, how awake they were, how advanced in their career. But after around about 1215, right, the Fourth Lateran Council, this is a time where confession becomes mandatory, right? Everyone has to do it once a year. And generally, they've been trying to sort out this thing called the Gregorian Reform from about the late 1000s. The Catholic Church is trying to make priests educated and well trained and attentive, so that there was a sense that before that it was more of a position in a community. It was a bit more informal. How systematic? Yeah, I mean, look, if you get a good priest, they will use a confessing manual, and these manuals will often be organized by the 7 deadly sins. So they'll work through them. Let's talk about your pride. How has it been this year? And this is a way to talk about your ego, your kind of cutting other people off, and so on. When we talk about anger, obviously that's a nice, give you a little on ramp to talk about any murders you've committed or terrible things you've done, and greed, likewise, any thefts. I mean, so the 7 deadly sins were a kind of spine that a priest could use to structure your confession. I mean, I'm sure that confessions could also be really informal and quick and whispered and casual as well, and pretty poor. But I know that by the early mid-1200s, people are shopping around for better priests. In some cases, you have stories like this. People. There's a great historian, Joseph Goering is his name, who's written some fantastic articles about this. If anyone's interested, about how confession worked. But yeah, it seems like the shopping around culture did develop a little bit. So people took this stuff really seriously, and they do seem to have been fairly systematic.
Yeah.
So I'm curious. So you had this kind of spark in Siberia of how the seven deadly sins had kind of modern relevance. Which one kind of struck you first about those, and how did you find it relevant to you, or your life and the world you're living in?
Well, I'll just say I found all seven of them extremely relevant every day. But I mean, I would say Acadia, sloth, the fourth deadly sin, was kind of the starting point for me.
Did you try throwing yourself in a really cold river every now and again? Because that would get rid of the lust quite quickly, apparently.
I think in Siberia that could be quite dangerous.
No, it can be very dangerous. Instead, I was going to the hot springs. I was doing the opposite. What was I thinking? So no, I mean, with Acadia, so with this, it's there's something so incredibly poignant about it, the way it's written about. So I talk about this in the book. In the introduction, like I was reading, as part of my teaching, I was teaching the seven deadly sins. So I was reading the famous work by William Peraldas, which is called The Summer of Vice. It's never been translated. It was enormous. It was in every library, I think, more or less in Europe. And when he talks about sloth, it makes you stop in your tracks. You feel like you're standing in the middle of a rushing river. It's furious and it's cold water and it's rushing towards your legs, but you have no energy to move. You know where you should be going, but you can't get there. You can't bring yourself to get there. And I think, oh my God, this book knows too much. This is my life.
Seems very relevant, to the modern day.
It is. And there are other texts. I mean, there's one in a library in Oxford called A Dialogue Between the Sinner and Reason. And there's this passage where this guy I think he's dressed up his own depressive episode in a dialogue between the sinner and this character Reason, kind of a typical medieval move, disguising your own feelings. But the sinner writes, I've had this terrible life, never done anything good. I've never done anything good in my life that wasn't just because I was trying to do something good. Therefore, it wasn't a real good act. And in our worst moments, and hopefully not, but in a depressive kind of spiral, oh my God, it does feel like that sometimes, And I think so many passages like that, and there's something so striking about it. You just think, oh, wow, that really feels so modern. To frame it this way, feels so modern. And you realize that the distance, suddenly the 800-year distance between you and these people just suddenly collapses into nothing at all. So I think Acadia was the one that struck me. Acadia is sloth, but sloth is a terrible translation. It's not laziness. In fact, in the Middle Ages, the Latin writers never translated it. They kept it in the Greek Acadia, which meant sort of lack of care. Sloth is when you just don't want to do anything. All the things that you used to love now leave you feeling cold. All the food you used to love just tastes like ashes in your mouth. All your favorite music is now just a drone in your ears. All your conversations, you're just going through the motions. There's no spark in your eyes anymore. And you go home and you just think, oh, another day chalked off. I think this is Acadia. And it's really, and why is it a deadly sin? Why is it not a mental health condition? And I think because, rewind to earlier, they're not deadly sins, they're generic thoughts. They're patterns of thought that we all get into, whether we like them or not. And this, for me, was the kind of gateway for me to understanding how these work, that these aren't just terrible flaws that only the terrible people do. These are the kinds of building blocks of what make us human, and we have to kind of work with them.
And what was the medieval kind of answer or response to sloth? And would it be relevant now, do you think?
Well, I mean, the answer to sloth was, and there was never an easy answer. I mean, I suppose there weren't really easy answers to any of these sins. The answer was to hold on and not to run away. I think that this is the thing, not to run away from your situation and think that that's the answer. So let's take Elizabeth of Schonau, right? So I write about her in the book. She was a nun in the Rhineland in the 1100s. She loved being a nun. She loved reading. She loved singing. Great life. Loved it all. One day she's late for mass and suddenly she doesn't want to join in. Lips don't move when the singing starts. And she realizes she doesn't want to read a book anymore. She doesn't want to finish a page. She can't be bothered. She doesn't want to turn up. In fact, she hates everything about being a nun all of a sudden. And this is Acadia. All the things you used to love have just suddenly been sucked away and you feel the weight of it. You feel the vacuum inside yourself. And for Elizabeth, her story, and she wrote really beautiful visions that she had, and her memoir as it is fantastic. But the answer for her was not to leave the convent. No, and this is never the answer. The answer was to keep going and try to remember the things that you love. For her, she has a vision, and look, we can't all hope to have a vision. The Virgin Mary appeared to her spinning like a wheel of fire, and it was really beautiful. But okay, so that's no good advice for anyone. But she ends up just rediscovering through this vision, I do love this. I do love this life. It's not that my life was on a wrong track. I'm on the right track. It's just, I need to sort of reanimate myself, restart my heart. The answer to sloth is to hold on and to remember that this is just a passing phase, and that it's the thing that will give you character when it's over. That's no good for depressives. And, I do not recommend this in place of medications, and CBT, which I think this is really CBT, but I don't recommend it in place of medications. But I think as a kind of a lighthouse, reminding you there's a light out there amidst the rocks, is kind of nice. The advice was hold on, and this will be the thing. Getting through this episode, getting through these rocks will be the thing that gives you character on the other side.
Although I suppose in all these cases, it's hold on and pray, and God will, send you a vision, or God will lead you to the next thing.
Yeah, I think that this kind of have faith in yourself as well. I think and recognize yourself. Like
that sounds like heretical thought. Have faith in yourself.
I think, yeah, maybe it is, but I don't know. I think these writers weren't naive. I don't think they thought. I think like Dante, right? Like Dante has the depressive episode at the start of the Divine Comedy. He gets out the other side. Yes, all right. He has a vision. Virgil comes and guides him, but he has to go through hell himself. He has to go through purgatory himself, and he has to see it all and confront it all. And a lot of these guys just give him abuse and remind him of how terrible he's been. And he has to reflect on how bad he's been. He faints at the end of chapter 5 of the Inferno because he remembers just, oh God, I've done this stuff myself. I should be in hell too. So I think, all right, have faith in God, but also have faith in yourself that, you're the way out of this too, I think.
Yeah, I wonder whether my question is almost a very modern way of thinking about it, that there's like a problem and an answer. And maybe it's just a different kind of narrative framework of understanding kind of human foibles.
Yeah, I think it is. I think that's exactly what it is. I think it's a kind of forgiving way of understanding human foibles, and that we could map all foibles ideally onto the 7. How far do we accept and tolerate our own foibles? When do they become deadly, if we use that word? And when are they just okay? I mean, take, for example, gluttony, right? Gluttony is the sin, not just of eating too much, right? It's also the sin of fixating on food and fussing about food. As Thomas Aquinas describes it that way. It's being unreasonable about food, which can include those things. So when does your foible, like I love almond croissants, right? They're my favorite thing. I love other things that are worse than that. I do like a glass of wine, all the rest of it. But I love almond croissants. And, I have to recognize, when is it's a foible of mine? When does it become how much powdered sugar on my trousers when I'm teaching? When have I gone too far? How many, is it when I'm making excuses and I'm pulling out of breakfast with friends because, I was counting on an almond croissant that day? I feel like our foibles become more than foibles. They become kind of problematic. And certainly, if we take Thomas Aquinas' word, when they become unreasonable, when I start becoming a bit antisocial because of them. And I think that's kind of, for me, reading all through the treatises of the deadly sins, that seems to be the thing that comes back again and again. It's when they make us antisocial. That's when they become a problem.
So you have this idea for the book, and then how did you bring it all together? Did you have an idea at the beginning of how you're going to explain this, or how you're going to write it?
Yeah, I mean, I knew I wanted to do the sins in order of Gregory the Great's order, and this is my control freakery. I just couldn't change that. That was fine. I wanted to be in Siberia because it's a great landscape in which to explore. You've driven your life into a dark place. Can you tunnel out? Can you tunnel out with the sins? So I was, and also I have to say, I mean, living in Siberia and teaching at that institution was so much fun, but also so kind of life defining and crazy in so many ways. It was such fuel for writing. So yeah, but I think, talking once we'd signed with the book, and I was talking with the editor, who's, what an incredible editor she is, Helen Conford, and at Hutchison Heinemann. And, she said, well, it doesn't all have to be in Siberia. I think if it's all in Siberia, we might be a bit limited. You want the book to sort of expand. And so I started to think, with her advice, about thinking about other times as in a career as a medieval historian. What I wanted to do was, through showing the reader the seven deadly sins, was to take you behind the curtain and show you how medievalists discover these things, and the kind of strange, obsessive life that you have as a medievalist, where you're sort of like putting on rubber gloves and sitting in squeaky chairs and poring over manuscripts with magnifying glasses, in totally silent rooms where you're kind of trapped. You've given over your ID and everything else, and you can't leave, because if you leave, they'll put the book away, and you can't come back. It's going to take a lot of hassle to come back. So I wanted to capture all those kind of quirks and idiosyncrasies, and I think it's fun for the reader to see kind of where this stuff comes from, the original place. And because one of the theses of the book, if you like, is that these things shouldn't be locked in archives. That they're not kind of locked away in dusty art. The knowledge of the Middle Ages shouldn't be locked away. It should be with all of us. So I wanted to bring people there too.
So you sold the concept of the book first, and then kind of fleshed it out.
Yeah, that's right. I had the I'd written this 20,000 word sample, so it was quite a big concept, like well fleshed out. But I had it very much sketched as teaching the seven deadly sins through the classroom, and I think it was more fun to go other places. And it was great. It meant I could visit in the book Valencia and Padua and all these other fun places too. Yeah,
sunnier, warmer places.
Exactly. Get out of the snow.
And was there a sin that you found, or the most difficult sin to write about?
Well, to answer that, avarice was the one I wasn't looking forward to. Greed, because I thought, this is too straightforward. I mean, greed. Don't chase after money. Isn't it? What is there that's interesting to say about this? What is it that the Middle Ages tells us that we don't necessarily think is obvious? And I think, in the end, reading, it was quite interesting when they start talking about how it makes you into an object. Like too much obsession with objects, you become the object. And also I was interested where, reading, there was kind of like people talking about objects having soul and objects not having soul. So that was, like, for example, the Holy Grail is an object, but it's completely legitimate to chase after it and to want it because of its immaculate power. And then I realized, this is an interesting philosophy of greed. Like, look without needing to possess for yourself. Look in wonder. And that became a way to sort of see, there's a really interesting way of seeing this. Gluttony, I was also a little bit nervous about, because I was writing in a little bit about fixation, but part of that was what we might now describe as anorexia, sort of food denial, which, came under the rubric of gluttony. Like, so Catherine of Siena, a lot of people thought she was a glutton because she only ate raw herbs, right? That was her only diet. And people would write to her at the time, in the 1300s saying, what are you playing at? Jesus ate, regular cooked food. Do you think you're better than him? You're a glutton, essentially. I found that difficult to write about, I think, because I know it's a very personal thing. And, I know it's and I suppose it's because I haven't necessarily had that particular issue. I felt like, I'm treading in difficult territory, whereas I didn't feel so bad writing about, ego problems, envy problems, anger problems. I've seen those, but, kind of food denial was a little bit more tender. And of course, lust. Obviously, lust was hard to write about. And there were sections my wife wanted to delete from the book at the last minute. But, that's different. That's different. But yeah, so yeah, the last three sins, I guess, the bodily stuff.
Interesting. So obviously our lots of people listen to this are either readers or writers of historical fiction. So what do you think writers of historical fiction like us could learn from the emotional and psychological depth of these medieval sources that you went to?
I think if you're writing historical fiction already, you're already on board with the main argument of the book, that let's take these people seriously as complex, deep emotional characters with exactly the same complex, deep psychologies as we have. I think the Seven Deadly Sins is a great place to go, to see the kind, especially the kinds of, maybe this book in particular, read this book and look at, follow up on the sources that I'm citing, and you'll see some of the most wonderful, tender writing, tender and personal writing. Read about Bernard of Clairvaux's struggles with lust, and you'll see, just how, how these things looked and felt to people. What lust felt like in the Middle Ages. Look at envy. Look at Petrarch. Read something like Petrarch's letters, and there's this lovely moment where Petrarch struggles with envy, really, and he's sort of struggling. There's this question: why didn't you own Dante's? You never owned a copy of Dante's Divine Comedy, and yet it's the greatest book of our age. And you, Petrarch, wasn't your father friends with Dante? Didn't he live with him even? And Petrarch's like, I just didn't want to own it because, I just didn't want to, I can't remember his excuse. It's some lame excuse. Like, I didn't want to accidentally copy it. We've all been there, is it? I mean, I think that read something like that and you'll see, aha, look, this is the kind of petty, sort of squabbles that people have, or like ways people are wrestling through problems. I just think I hope that the sources in this book could be like an invitation to read more deeply in these kinds of, precisely in this kind of tender, personal writing there's so much of it in the Middle Ages. And I just urge readers to go beyond the chronicles, which are kind of often very event-based, to look at theology, because theology is where people really pour their hearts out a lot of the time. And letters, of course, like the personal letters, of course they do. But I mean, it is kind of the sermons. Bernard of Clairvaux, it's the sermons where he's really revealing himself, his humor, his personality, his kind of temptations. They're there in the sermons. So I'm hoping the book is an invitation to sort of go beyond the kind of where you might expect to find the psychology of the Middle Ages to kind of these more theological texts. And I think that's where your listeners will find some of the more fun psychological wrestlings of medieval people.
And if there was a medieval figure from these that you would like to sort of sit and chat with now, who would that be? Who do you think would be the most stimulating?
Oh my God. What a question. All of them. And I feel like I have spoken with all of them by writing about them. I mean, look, I'm going to cop out and say Dante, just because the mystery of Dante, what was his ego like? This is someone who writes a story about himself going to paradise because he's been granted special permission to do it. This is someone who's reportedly singed his own eyebrows. This is the story. So people would believe he really did go down to hell. Or at least that's Boccaccio's story. Or he liked people to believe that. But this is someone who, has, Virgil guiding him. And, he's putting himself on a pedestal next to Virgil, So I want to know what was his ego like? I want to know what his kind of, I also want to know about Dante. Was he a good family man or not? How did he love? This is someone who married Gemma, and yet still wrote all this love poetry to Beatrice. Did she really exist? Was it just a fantasy? So how did that work? Was he a good family man or not? He abandoned his family. He was exiled and he left his family in Florence and he left them behind. Like, was that because he didn't ever really care about them? Or was there something else going on? Or did he have a back channel? Did he smuggle them out? And we only think he abandoned them. So I want to know everything about Dante, these mysteries. I'd love to sit down with, oh my goodness. I'd love to sit down with, obviously Bernard, that we've already been through here. We've been over him.
Lustful Bernard.
Yeah, Marjorie Kemp. I'd love to sit down with Marjorie because Norfolk woman, just like my mother, she lives in Norfolk. I'd like to know, Marjorie had 14 children. Did I count them right? Maybe I've got the number wrong. She only mentions one of them in her memoir. What was she like? This is someone who wept every day in the church when she had a life conversion, a midlife crisis, which went, she became a heartfelt believer. And a memoirist. She's the first autobiographer in the English language, isn't she? And so she went further on the page than anyone else had gone. She never mentions those 13 other children, just the one. What was she like? Was she intense, or is that just an effect of the page? Was she, in fact, writing her intensity and everything else? She's actually a very canny writer who's mapping an intensity on the page because that will be engaging. And she's actually, so I'd love to meet her too. All of them is my cop-out answer, but Dante and Marjorie, they'd be my top choices.
That'd be a dinner date. You could have the two of them, and some
gosh,
almond croissants.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And a glass of wine. They'd love that. If listeners could take away one idea from the book, what would you like that to be? I guess
I'd like that to be. Yeah, I mean, look.
Already, yeah.
I'll have the evangelical idea and then the historical idea, I suppose. The evangelical idea, which I hope I'm saying that in jest, right? The seven deadly sins are a fantastic source of comfort. If like me, you screw up in all seven ways all the time, that actually we can't be the perfect person and live without envy and live without anger. But there are seven really good lessons in here, I think, that are more than truisms, that actually punch hard. If you titbit, I mean, like anger, the problem with anger is that you are addicted to being right. And the medieval writers recognize this, that anger isn't really a problem with violence and murder. That is also a problem, but that's obvious. The less obvious problem, anger is an addiction to being right, and recognizing that. And when you're doing that, instead of being angry for the right reasons, I think the advice, there's kind of seven varieties of that advice, which I think your listeners would get from reading the book, that certainly have helped me come to terms with seven terrible things within myself. That's kind of the evangelical thing out of the way. The historical thing, look, I know your listeners respect the Middle Ages, as a universe in itself. But these people, if there's one thing, these people felt whatever you're feeling, whatever ups and downs, anxieties, strange pettinesses, lonely, weird, half-formed anxieties that you're having at 5 a.m. They had them too. The twist is they wrote about them, and they wrote beautifully about them. Why? Because the great writers of the Middle Ages, they spent from the age of 9 to the age of 99 in a cloister with nothing else to do and no one to talk to a lot of the time but their own mind. And I think that's why people in the Middle Ages wrote so well about those little half-formed, strange, tempting, weird thoughts, because they were left alone with those thoughts so much. And also it was their day job to write about temptation, because that's what kind of monks had to do. So that's my historical lesson. It's a treasure trove. It's a universe of kind of beautiful, exquisite writing about the inner workings of the mind. And it's out there, and it's under the label theology, but we could call it self-help too.
Brilliant. Well, thanks ever so much. I think people will have really enjoyed listening to you on the episode. And the book, Self-Help from the Middle Ages, when is it out? Is it out already? Has it already been published?
It's out on the 2nd of April. So whether it's out already when the episode goes out, but it's out Thursday, the 2nd of April, the day before Good Friday. And it's hardback and all good bookshops. But there's also an audiobook as well.
Brilliant. Who reads the audiobook? Do you read the audiobook, or is it someone else?
I do read the audiobook, yeah, and that was tough. Yeah.
That's interesting, yeah.
2,000 retakes, but we got through it in the end.
Yeah, I've only been asked to read the historical note of one of my audiobooks, and that was only about 4 pages or something, and I think I had to do about 10 sort of retakes of different bits just in that pronunciation of words.
When it's retake number 3+, you never get it right, because you're just so conscious about that word, and you're just terrified and swallow when it comes. But yeah.
Brilliant. Well, best of luck for the book, and I hope it sells incredibly well. And thanks ever so much for coming on and talking to us about it.
Oh, thanks. It's been an absolute pleasure. I really enjoyed this. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was great.
That was wonderful. Yes, amazing. What a great guest. You just so enthusiastic about his subject, so knowledgeable, so balanced in his responses, I think, as well. I mean, it's difficult. I find it quite an interesting, well, it's a very interesting subject, but I think it's interesting how I touched on it, some of the questioning, that it's clearly religious. There's clearly huge amounts of religion wrapped up in the subject matter, which he didn't completely sidestep, but at the same time, he doesn't dwell on the religiosity of it all. It's quite cleverly, I think. It's interesting, because try to make it like a humanist framework for how to live your life for me, it's quite a leap, because I think the religion is much. I think it rears its head a lot more strongly than he would have you think it does, if that makes sense.
You're underplaying it. Yeah, interesting. But I guess you can't get into the heads of characters of the Middle Ages without kind of accepting that they have a religious mindset.
But all I mean, pretty much all the people that he's talking about, as he said at the end, they're all sitting in cloisters all day. They all were religious, and they're all like at the pinnacle of peak religious people. They're people that are converting all of their brothers to become monks and stuff. I mean, these are very, very religious people, or these aesthetes. How do you pronounce it? Like the living
aesthetes,
off in aesthetes, living off in the desert, in with lice-ridden shirts and standing in freezing water and stuff. I mean, they're not normal people.
Edward Gibbon.
They're not brilliantly normal people that you think, I really want to, I want them to tell me how to live my life.
There's the Stigilites who sit on columns, and Edward Gibbon is very dismissive of them. So very interesting. And I wonder I mean, the stuff like the 7 deadly sins, it's not in the Bible. So religion or Christianity in the West it's religious, but it's also philosophy as well, isn't it? It's kind of a development of, coming into kind of, the period we're interested in is kind of philosophy that converts kind of violent pagan Germanic tribes into, people who are more like us, and civilized in many ways. So it's philosophy and religion.
I guess, and I suppose it's like it's looking at a way of maybe of civilizing people's thoughts. You're thinking at ways of tackling thoughts that are intrusive and difficult, and urges. I mean, talk about this. I think I've really got an issue with the fact that they're called 7 deadly sins, because it makes it sound incredibly like a whole thing about religion, whereas really this 7 generic thoughts or 8 generic thoughts sounds much more of a logical approach, because they are just generic. And I think it doesn't matter what religion you are. Somebody who's never heard of Christianity is still going to have lust, or feel lust or anger or all of these things. So. Yeah, it's really interesting, really very interesting book, and his approach to telling it is very personable, as you could tell. Everyone, to our listeners, hearing Peter, talking about his journey and how he investigated all of these different sins and the approach the medieval writers had into how to combat these things. He does it really well. I mean, the book's very, very readable, very interesting.
And he lived abroad as well. Of course, we're pet fans of people who live abroad. Having both done it ourselves. Not compulsory to be a writer, but
no, it's not compulsory, but it expands your mind. And he's lived in all sorts of places, and now lives in Madrid. We ascertained before we came on air. So, he's lived in all sorts of countries, and now settled for the time being in Madrid, and says he loves it. So obviously, he's a clever guy, because Madrid is great.
Yeah, but I thought your Spanish accent was a little better than his.
Well, this is all took place off camera before we came.
His probably much better than mine.
It's a weird thing. I think when you, people call me. I think people think it's pretentious when you pronounce things.
Well, just people who don't know, you went to Spain when you were 14 and kind of grew up there.
Yeah.
So you are pretty fluent.
But so when you sometimes when I go into a shop or a restaurant or something, I order something that's Spanish on the menu and pronounce it in Spanish. Yeah. With like English people, I could tell sometimes they think, like, what a pretentious wanker. Why is he saying chorizo instead of chorizo or whatever? It's because you can't. It's difficult to pronounce things wrong when you know how to pronounce
to go back.
Yeah. But we digress. It was a great episode. I really enjoyed it.
Really interesting.
We hope you did too, because that's it for today's episode. Don't forget to leave a review and subscribe to the podcast. If you haven't done it already, please subscribe. If you're watching it on YouTube, subscribe, like the YouTube channel, subscribe whichever podcast viewer you are using, or listener, or whatever you call them, podcast catcher. Subscribe, because it really helps you see the next episodes that come out, but also helps with visibility for us, I think, as well.
And as Peter said, there's many more great episodes with fabulous writers and historians and purveyors of the historical periods.
I think, unfortunately, he said that after we'd stopped recording.
No, he didn't he?
Yeah,
well,
he said,
we can both vouch for it.
We can vouch for the truth of this. He said he'd listened and he liked the theme tune and he liked the conversations we had, and he said all nice things. We definitely need to record that at the end, because then we can use the snippets of people saying nice things about us. And if they say something embarrassing, we can then share that as well. But so go back and listen to all of our previous episodes. There are lots and lots of them. I mean, it must be close to 100, if not more than 100. I don't know. There's loads of them. So go back and it must be more than 100. What am I saying? We've been doing one every 2 weeks for 3.5, 4 years. So there must be lots.
Sit alone in a room and soak it up.
Well, anyway, if you're walking a dog or something, every time I discover a new podcast that I really like, it becomes like my go-to thing for a while. And I'll go through all of the back catalogue and I'll find the episodes that look interesting. I might not listen to every single episode, but it depends on the podcast. But sometimes maybe they've got 150 episodes, but you go back and you listen to episode 12 and episode 17, episode 9. You look through and you say, "Oh, this one sounds interesting." So go back and have a look what we got, and listen to back catalogue and let us know. Anyway, thanks to everybody for listening, and thanks, of course, to our patrons on Patreon, and a special shout out to our Patreon producers. And they are, at this time, until we sign up more, but please join them, Ben Mayer, Ben Fox, George Johnson, and Matt Muller. And
Andy Maxwell.
Andy Maxwell, I've already said Andy Maxwell, didn't I?
Did you say him? I think, anyway. And Adam Turner, who is our legend.
He is our legend. Sorry, we're speaking over each other. That was very, very confusing. Right, over to you.
You can sign up on Patreon to support us from as little as £1 per month. And don't forget, there are now new tiers with even more rewards.
It's true. Don't forget. Go and sign up right now. You know you want to. But until next time on Rock, Paper, Swords, it's goodbye from me, Matthew Harffy.
And it's goodbye from me, Justin Hill.
And remember, whatever action and adventure you have going on in your life, be kind.
Stay safe.
And happy reading. Hasta luego.